A dialogue between the President of the United States and the Russian leader is necessary to end the war in Ukraine. This was stated by U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance in an interview with Fox News. He noted that he had heard a lot of criticism directed at Donald Trump for talking with Putin, but emphasized that achieving peace requires strength as well as active and assertive diplomacy. At the same time, Vance stressed that dialogue does not mean agreeing with the Kremlin's decisions to invade Ukraine. Ihor Chalenko is with me in the studio, a political scientist and head of the Center for Analysis and Strategy. Mr. Ihor, welcome.
Good afternoon.
So the question is, whom should we trust? J.D. Vance, who says, well, listen, negotiations are necessary in any case because someone has to engage in this dialogue. Or did he actually mean something else?
Well, J.D. Vance still refers to it as aggressive diplomacy, and accordingly, he needs to explain why communication is happening in some areas and in others specific sanctions are being imposed, as we've seen with Lukoil and Rosneft. Obviously, the Russians are clearly trying to take advantage of this situation in several ways, but after the imposition of those significant sanctions I mentioned earlier, I think the overall mood in the Kremlin has worsened somewhat. Although what is really lacking here is a certain degree of toughness and resilience, specifically from the United States. Because now we see the news that, as it turns out, the sanctions against Lukoil will not be imposed on November 21st, but now on December 13th. And this is explained by saying, you see, it's necessary to sell, it's necessary to, well, I think that such things should really be adhered to as strictly as possible. And potential buyers, if they really exist. We know that there are many companies involved, both from Arab countries and not only them. I think they could have bought all of this from the Russians at an even bigger discount, and accordingly, the Russians would have received even less money. But nevertheless, I think this actually demonstrates a significant shift in the overall policy of the Trump administration, especially if you compare it, say, to 6 months ago. Remember how it was then and how it is now. So, in principle, this is a demonstration of the effectiveness of Ukrainian diplomacy, although, of course, we still need to keep working on this track. Because as soon as we lose momentum or scale in this communication, naturally, the Russians try to push their own agenda.
Mr. Ihor, as you know, it was exactly the same 6 months ago. I give Putin 50 days to end the war. Then there were another 20 days added for a certain diplomatic decision. Then let's give another 30 days so that Putin and Zelensky could negotiate or meet, or at least discuss the various platforms for such a meeting. What we're talking about now is this current situation of energy and oil dependence. What do you think, will this deadline be extended? And, well, what could this actually lead to?
Well, of course, I would like the deadline not to be extended or pushed back so that the sanctions would finally start working in full. And the second point is that I don't accept statements like, for example, from Marco Rubio, who says that we've already reached the limit of imposing sanctions and restrictions against the Russian Federation. I think we definitely haven't reached that limit. At the very least, Russia can be declared a state sponsor of terrorism. This would be a very serious blow to the financial sector of their partners. We know how seriously Americans treat this whole issue, especially when it comes to money laundering and so on. They would be much more actively engaged in carefully inspecting this. The second point concerns the confiscation of immobilized assets that are currently located directly in the United States. According to various estimates, they amount to between $5 and $8 billion. And this would be a good signal, for example, to European partners who are currently discussing a reparations loan. So in fact, there is still room for growth. The same goes for the nuclear sector, where we actually see a weakening of the sanctions regime, for example, regarding the Hungarian nuclear power plant PAX-2, where Rosatom is directly involved in the construction. So this actually shows that we would like to see a more predictable and more stable policy from the United States, rather than attempts to achieve the desired result through sudden moves.
Why does Trump really need such a quick and close dialogue with Putin today? Right now?
Well, we fully understand that former President Trump truly needs to see results, and this is exactly in line with the fact that their so-called government shutdown issue has supposedly been resolved for now in the United States. But there are still many different and complex issues internally. There are also the Epstein tapes and other significant scandals which, well, have a very unpleasant impact on the internal American political scene. And as for the direct pre-election period, because we know that the congressional elections will be held in November next year, and accordingly this is already being perceived in that light, meaning that Trump cannot afford to show weakness. By the way, note that he even has to distance himself from certain members of the Republican Party, for example, from Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has been very active, even working in a certain pro-Moscow direction and expressing a number of anti-Ukrainian statements. And we see that Trump has distanced himself from her. By the way, in my opinion, this is a very positive signal for us. Nevertheless, it's clear that Trump wants the war to end as soon as possible. Just as Ukraine once said that it would like the war to end by the end of this year. But as we can see from the aggressor's activity, there are not enough signals from Moscow to end the war. Therefore, Ihor, it is abundantly clear that we absolutely need to use all possible mechanisms to put direct pressure on Putin, including in particular Trump's communication with the Russians.
Well, even those who supported a certain kind of ideology, for example, if we talk about Hungary, even now we hear public statements from Orban himself saying, well, we really do not know what other levers there might be, that in fact these diplomatic levers to influence Russia and to influence Putin simply do not actually exist. So how should this be perceived? Because it's necessary to talk. And even the president of Ukraine says that we are ready to talk, we are ready to meet, to discuss, to resolve things, to end the war. But there is silence from the Kremlin. What are these levers? Or, well, are we talking about diplomacy right now, or are we talking more about the economy? Because honestly, it's already unclear who should take this step and when.
I think it's important here to maintain a comprehensive approach to pressure, meaning further strengthening of sanctions and working on the 20th package of sanctions. Still, I think the United States shouldn't be talking about any kind of ceiling. They should actually maintain this principle of strategic ambiguity plus the military component. A huge success for the defense forces of Ukraine is related to the deep strikes. By the way, since the beginning of this year, more than 250 targets have been successfully hit in the Russian rear. These are large facilities, not only military ones, but also oil refineries and now energy infrastructure sites. That is, this is really having a very serious impact on the Russian economy, which, well, may actually reach a point where there will be no growth by the end of the year, which was planned there, 1% of GDP. And then these forecasts were already lowered. Well, plus, I'd like to point out that right now the Russians are selling their oil at a discount of almost $20. The situation has become so critical that basically their daily volume has also decreased. That is, if we look at October, it was just over 4 million barrels per day. At the beginning of the year, it was 5 million barrels per day that the Russians were shipping. Right now, their oil exports are falling, and the overall price at which they sell is also dropping. This is exactly what is hitting their economy. This approach needs to be continued and strengthened.
The 20th package of sanctions is already under consideration, and we've already heard about the shadow fleet and about sanctions being applied to certain individuals from the Russian Federation. What else could be new? Well, for example, things that haven't been touched by these 19 packages. Or will we still focus on what has already been accomplished, but with even greater impact?
I think there should be more issues of secondary restrictions that...
Secondary...
Because regarding our partners, we see that even the United States has imposed 50% tariffs on India, and the whole topic has, for a while, languished on China. The issue is not moving forward in Congress. For example, where there was a proposal from Graham Blumenthal for 500% tariffs, specifically concerning partners of the Russian Federation. Next is the issue that concerns, again, nuclear energy. We need to keep pushing on this because it's over $10 billion that Russia is simply making out of thin air. Next is the issue of components used to assemble missiles and then drones, unmanned aerial vehicles. We can see that, yes, spare parts are being found with an increasing percentage coming from China, but there are also Western companies involved. Accordingly, we also need to work quite hard in this area. That is, we need to understand that this work must continue to intensify, because it's very easy to say, let's stop introducing new sanctions, since there are problems with the old ones. We need to introduce new ones and also close the loopholes in the old ones. In other words, these two things do not interfere with each other in any way.
Let's also take a moment to discuss China's influence, because there are different positions and perspectives on this issue today. US President Donald Trump is also actively trying not to lose this important connection. And there was also an interesting question here in the economy. One moment it's 200% tariffs, then we cancel them. Or let's make a deal now and there will be no economic influence at all, we'll cooperate together. What position does China support and adhere to today? And why does Trump change his mind so often?
I think that in our specific case, which directly concerns the Russian-Ukrainian war, China understands its own value in this process, but is in no hurry to give clear and explicit signals toward ending it. That is, it continues accordingly to raise the price for itself. In other words, what does it want to ask from Trump in exchange for these things? So it's clear that our situation will be played as part of a package deal. And the fact that a meeting is scheduled to take place in April next year, as planned,